So we've talked about how natural selection can cause the evolution of a species, right? Individuals with adaptations that make them more fit in a particular environment can, over time, lead to a change in the traits and the characteristics of that species at a population level. However, I think it's reasonable to ask, well, if this is how it works on a single species, where do new species come from? And so to try to get at answering that question, I'd like to tell you a story about a population of birds. And this population of birds lives on an island that has very large seeds, and in order to effectively eat those seeds, these birds have very large beaks. And now imagine a storm comes rolling through, and some of those birds are blown across the way to an island that doesn't have large seeds, it has small seeds. And so those birds have some variation in beak size, right? Some birds have slightly larger beaks, some birds have slightly smaller beaks. However, in this new environment, with these smaller seeds, which kinds of birds do you expect to be more fit? Right? The birds that have smaller beaks are going to have an easier time with the smaller seeds, and over many years, over a very long time, that fitness adaptation results in the evolution of birds on this island to have smaller beaks than the birds on the island with the larger seeds. Now, this happened over a long period of time. But remember that these two populations, right, now potentially individual species, right, a species with small beaks, a species with large beaks, they came from a single species, right? And so as time progressed, that single species, which we'll represent right here, diverged into these two species. And we can actually use this idea of a kind of a tree diagram called a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram sometimes to represent the relationships between every living species on Earth. And so we might represent the birds. However, birds share a significant amount of shares a significant similarity with reptiles. But all birds and all reptiles evolved from a common ancestor species. And that common ancestor shares a significant number of traits with mammals. But mammals, reptiles, and birds all evolved from a common ancestor with fish. Right? And remember, if time is read from left to right here, we're also reading it from root to branch, right? Further back in time was the last common ancestor of all of these species. However, it was much closer, more recent in history that existed the last common ancestor between birds and reptiles. And there's actually another thing that we can infer from a tree like this, which is that we actually can begin to think about what the characteristics of these earlier ancestors might be. And the way that we generally think about those things is we look at the characteristics of the species that evolved from them, and the similarities we imagine probably were shared by these common ancestors. And so, for example, reptiles, birds, and mammals, right? So here's the last common ancestor. How many limbs did that common ancestor have? Well, birds have 2 legs and 2 wings. Reptiles have 4 legs. Mammals have 4 legs, or in our case, 2 legs and 2 arms. And so this ancestor probably had 4 limbs. Fish have fins, but they don't necessarily have the kinds of limbs as we think about them. But what is in common between fish, mammals, reptiles, and birds? What kinds of characteristics might you imagine this ancestor to have had? Well, how about a backbone, right? All of these organisms have backbones. All of these organisms have two eyes. All of these organisms have a recognizable head and kind of the rest of their body. All of these traits likely evolved back here in time and were present in this ancestor prior to that ancestral species splitting into fish, mammals, reptiles, and birds.